The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus said to his disciples, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, escorted by all the angels, then he will take his seat on his throne of glory. All the nations will be assembled before him, and he will separate men one from another, as a shepherd separates sheep from goats. He will place the sheep on his right hand and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you whom my Father has blessed. Take for your heritage the kingdom prepared for you since the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you made me welcome. Naked, and you clothed me. Sick, and you visited me. In prison, and you came to see me.' Then the virtuous will say to him in reply, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and make you welcome, naked and clothe you, sick or in prison and go to see you?' And the king will answer, 'I tell you solemnly, insofar as you did this to one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did it to me.' Next he will say to those on his left hand, 'Go away from me, with your curse upon you, to the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you never gave me food. I was thirsty, and you never gave me anything to drink. I was a stranger, and you never made me welcome, naked, and you never clothed me, sick and in prison, and you never visited me.' Then it will be their turn to ask, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, a stranger or naked, sick or in prison, and did not come to your help?' Then he will answer, 'I tell you solemnly, insofar as you neglected to do this to one of the least of these, you neglected to do it to me.' And they will go away to eternal punishment, and the virtuous to eternal life." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
This weekend, the feast, the solemnity of Christ the King, Christ our universal Lord and King, is the end of the liturgical year, and therefore next week begins the season of Advent. It's also in Matthew's Gospel, which we've been reading throughout this year, the end of this passage itself is the end of Jesus' public ministry, and therefore we're in chapter 25 of Matthew's Gospel. In chapter 26 onwards, we begin the narrative of Jesus' trial and passion and death. The thing that is interesting as we reflect on Matthew's Gospel, the reading given to us for the Christ the King this year in Matthew's year, is that the last 2 weeks have also been readings from chapter 25. And therefore, the whole of chapter 25 is summarized in what we're reading today. 2 weeks ago, we heard the parable of what? 10 virgins, 10 bridesmaids who were waiting on the bridegroom. 5 who were foolish and therefore did not have the oil, and 5 who were wise and therefore had the oil. And what we saw there is that what we do or don't do matters. You with me? What we do in having that oil ready, and therefore at the end of that passage, Jesus gives what we may call the linchpin that everything there hangs on, that stay awake, because you do not know the time. And therefore what we do or what we don't do matters in this life. Last week's gospel, likewise, we see this parable of this master who gives these talents, and a talent is a great deal of money in ancient Near East culture. And therefore, there's this one person who receives 1 talent. And what does he do with it? He goes and buries it. He hides it. Why? Because he had heard. You know how many people make mistakes off of things they've heard? He had heard, and therefore he had a wrong idea of the master. And he buried his talent. And what does the master do? He says, take it away from him, and bind him, and throw him out. What we do, or what we don't do in this life, matters. And then, if we did not get that message clear in these last 2 weeks as we read through chapter 25, well, today Jesus spells it out in very plain language. As he speaks about his second coming, when the Son of Man comes again in glory, he says, and we know from the creed, he will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead. So that when he comes again in glory, and this is the last judgment, when, of course, there'll be the resurrection of the dead, so everyone who ever lived will be judged. This is what will happen. And he gives us this analogy of sheep and goats. And if we are not a pastoral culture in Trinidad anymore, but people who have sheep or goats know that sheep are, well, a little more docile than goats. And sometimes if when you drive through the country, you see someone with a rope tied around a goat's neck, pulling it, and it's fighting. And so Jesus is saying to us, well, this is how it will be. What you do matters, yes. Were you stubborn and fighting my will, or were you following and listening to my voice? What did we do? Therefore, what we do and what we don't do, the sin of omission, is very important for us to look at. Sometimes when you speak with children in a school or in a retreat, and you say to them, well, who did this? And they say, I didn't do that, I did nothing. And what the Lord is saying is that's a problem too. The way in which we may say, I did nothing, I did not do that. That's a problem too. What is there that we should be doing that allows us to live the life that the Lord has invited us to live? The ones who enter the kingdom of heaven are those who listen to his voice, are those who have followed his will, are those who live this life that the Lord offers us. And therefore, they're the ones who, in their actions, become more like Christ. If we remember, 2 weeks ago, the bridesmaids the foolish ones, who went to get the oil, and then came back at a later hour, and then they knocked on the door. What did they say? Lord, Lord, here we are. And what did he say? I don't know you. Now, if you read Matthew's gospel carefully, especially the Sermon on the Mount, which is at the heart of the gospel, what you see is, you see this pattern repeated. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, very frightening words. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. We may say, well, Jesus, what do you mean by that? And he goes on there to specify, well, on that day, many will come to me saying, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many deeds of power in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Go away from me, you evildoers. Frightening. Frightening words. In other words, it is not sufficient to say that faith alone guarantees our salvation. And there are ways of thinking perpetuated in Christianity and in our culture today that says, well, we just need to believe, and we're fine. And on the contrary, Jesus is saying that's not enough. In fact, he says in the same Sermon on the Mount, a few verses before, by their fruits you will know them. Or, let your light so shine, in chapter 5 of Matthew's Gospel, let your light so shine before men that seeing your good works, they may give praise to the Father in heaven. So that if we are called to be disciples of Christ, true subjects of the King, then we have to look at how do we live? Are we living in ways that allows this light of Christ to shine in and through us through our good works? Not through what we say. As we know, unfortunately today, there are many things we say that have no weight and that you can't take as integrity and honesty. And therefore, we enter into all sorts of legal contracts. But Jesus is saying it's more than that. It's much, much more than that. So we have to resist this way of thinking. That if we just believe, we just do enough to slide in there. Jesus is saying, that's not true. That is not true. There's something that is frightening, where we are in our parish, and going around to many different churches and retreats. Sometimes you hear people say, and it's not located in one place or another, but you hear it in different places, Father, I love the church and I love the Lord, I just cannot stand church people. You ever heard that? You ever felt like that? Don't answer that. But well, this gospel is for us today. that they're the people we have to learn to love. Or we may say, I love the Lord, but I cannot stand these people in my family. Or I love the Lord and I cannot stand these people in my community or my workplace. It'll be so much easier. Somebody said to me, I just want to be a hermit. But what God invites us to realize is that it is in the living of our relationships one with the other that we truly come to live the gospel. That we truly allow our light to shine. And it is there in those places where we feel most awkward, where we feel this is so messy, where this is so difficult, it is there where our light must shine. It is there upon which we'll be judged. Let's see what you did. Were you being Jesus there? And therefore, what Jesus does in all of this is bring this direct connection between the two great commandments, which we heard a few weeks ago in the Gospel from Matthew chapter 22. Love of God and love of neighbor. That there is a direct connection. When we say we love God, well, ask your spouse, how do you live? Ask your family, how do you live? Ask your friends, ask your co-workers, how do you live? That is the way in which the Lord will see it. And we may say, wow, that's hard. But also, we know that God's Spirit is at work, giving us the grace we need to grow, to change, to develop, because of His mercy. In our first reading, the prophet Ezekiel, and Ezekiel writes in the Babylonian exile. So Ezekiel is this prophet writing and encouraging them. And in the midst of their despair, what Ezekiel says to them is this most beautiful passage about the Lord who is shepherd. And what the word of the Lord comes to Ezekiel saying is, in the midst of these horrible leaders that you have had, this crisis of leadership that has existed in Israel and has led you into the exile where my people have been scattered, I myself will come and shepherd you. I myself will become the one who gathers you from far. I myself will do it. And therefore, in the midst of our lives and the way in which we feel living this way of the Lord is so difficult, we have to also remember that the grace of God is there, because the Lord Himself is continuously at work in our lives, bringing us to salvation, if we open our hearts. If we open our hearts, then every single opportunity, every single challenge becomes an opportunity for living, for showing forth Christ. And that's not easy. Of course it's not easy. Especially when you have lots of baggage and pain and resentment and bitterness surrounding certain relationships in our lives. The question that is quite instructive on a careful read of the passage is the question, Lord, when did we see you? When did we see you hungry or thirsty or naked or a stranger? When did we see you sick or imprisoned? When did we see you in need of my help in calling out to me? And therefore, the other aspect that we must keep in mind is, how are we doing at really seeing with the eyes of Christ? In a world where, yes, we've gotten so accustomed to the famous refrain, I'm busy. We're all busy. But in the midst of that busyness, guess what? We don't see. We can't see if we continuously on the run. We can't see if we've become desensitized because of all the news and all the painful realities around us. Then we can't truly see who is before us. They become just another one. We can't see if all we do is we're stuck on our screens. We can't see. Therefore, we have to learn to slow down and pay attention to what is before us and who may be in our very midst crying out for help, some attention, love, an ear to listen to. Because they are hungry or thirsty or naked or in need. Sometimes we can't see because we are so caught up in ourselves and our need to be right, therefore this self-righteous approach. Or hung up on our prejudices or envy or jealousy, and we can't celebrate with each other. But whatever the reason, in the end, the question that they all pose to the Lord is, when did we see you? like this or that. And Jesus says, well, insofar as you did it to the least of these, insofar as you were able to recognize in them an invitation for relationship, for you to love, then you did it to me. Then you did it to me. Pope Francis last week launched the first World Day of the Poor. And in his message on World Day of the Poor, what he said, and it's quite timely, seeing that this gospel is coming right after, he said that Jesus' word is quite clear. The poor, in the many different forms of poverty that exist, are our way to heaven. That's basically what it says. Those are not my words, those are Pope Francis' words. They're our way to heaven. As we see, as we recognize the person before us and the invitation they're giving us to love, to care. Not just out there, sometimes it's in our own families we just cannot stand to even help. As, you know, Archbishop Harris's famous words that he likes to use, that quite often we are street angels and home devils. You know, the horns grow once we close the door. That, you know, it's there. It's there too. When did we see each other in need and stop ignoring each other? Therefore, we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of reflection to do. And we have a lot of opening our hearts to the power and the grace of God to do, so that we become more and more who God desires us to be. Let us pray that as we enter into this liturgy, that we may truly live as subjects of the King, Christ as King. And his kingdom is one of service and love. His kingdom is one where we see those that God places in our path, and we act upon it, because we will be judged by what we do and what we don't do. Finally, there's a way in our culture in which, you know, we live in this cellular age and technological age where, you know, you can have a top-up, or as some companies offer, you can get a bly from your friend when you run out of money, or this way in which we think we could always borrow and, you know, squeeze our way through. But there's something about salvation that Jesus is also teaching us, that when we stand before the Lord, there will be no topping up or borrowing. And we saw that in the first parable of Matthew 25, when these foolish bridesmaids asked for some oil, and the other said it wouldn't be enough for us and you. And some people say, well, that was so wicked of them. But when it comes to salvation and we stand before the Lord, you cannot turn to your grandmother or your grandfather or your mom or your father or your brother or your sister and say, lend me some of your good works so I could put it in my good works record. When we stand before God, exactly as we are, is exactly how we will be judged. And therefore, let us ask the Lord for the grace to act in ways that allow us to stand before God in true humility, saying, Lord, I am a sinner, but I did my best. I loved you in the many faces I saw around me, and I saw you. Amen.